accused me of being quiet, so I'm hoping that still holds. So I want to begin by thanking Dr. Murphy for inviting me to be with you this evening and for over a decade of friendship. You're both a thoughtful scholar and a fabulous friend. I also wish to extend my gratitude to the Guyton Family Foundation and Augustana for making this whole trip possible and for coordinating my travel difficulties to be here. So I want to begin by stating what I think is obvious. In 2013, interreligious dialogue is a crucial and necessary component to navigating our religiously plural world. In a world filled with people espousing a variety of creeds, we must directly engage this reality, and thus we need to both really and truly encounter the individuals in our communities who do not share our faith commitments, as well as learn and better understand the different religious traditions that animate the lives and thoughts of our neighbors. I want to acknowledge both the bad and the good that can come from deeply engaging the religious beliefs and commitments of others. When we invite religious outsiders to understand and even critique our own beliefs and religious interpretations, we make ourselves vulnerable, open to the possibilities of difficult discussion. I contend that such engagement is not optional, but necessary for sustained coexistence. So what can we do? Interreligious dialogue can take on many different forms, and each form has distinct and sometimes different benefits. First form, social action. You bring together a group of people of different faiths to engage in social actions, such as building a home, working in a soup kitchen, or engaging in other forms of community service. These types of activities are vitally important because they accomplish the very minimum two things: a basis for building friendships across religious lines, and trust between persons. And they demonstrate the fact that individuals of varying faith commitments share a common interest in improving the community and helping those in need. This type of interreligious encounter creates a solid basis for other types of engagement, and I believe is a good and vital first step. More difficult and challenging conversations always benefit if they occur between friends who have a certain level of trust built up within their relationship. A second form of interreligious encounter involves basic learning. That is to say, achieving a certain degree of literacy or fluency in a religious tradition that is not your own. This type of engagement with a different religious tradition can come through a variety of means. A common one is the lecture. For example, I often give presentations at synagogues on Roman Catholicism. Recently, everyone wants to know about Pope Francis and the context for his actions. Even if I'm talking about something else entirely, everyone ends up talking about Francis again. The other, of course, is the basic sort of books model of literacy. So you can go out and read histories of religious tradition as well as an account of basic practices and beliefs. And of course, if you have a friend who maybe you've done service learning together, you could ask him or her basic questions about her religious life, her community, and invite her to ask you questions about your religious life and your community. A third form of interreligious encounter is based on the study of texts and materials sacred and or central to a religious tradition. This is principally what I do for a living, namely gathering together religious texts, images, rituals from Christian, Jewish, and increasingly Muslim traditions for groups of ministers and rabbis who regularly study together, as well as groups of adults who, like yourself, are interested in interreligious learning. This type of encounter is incredibly challenging, but can be extremely rewarding in its results. It allows all participants involved to directly grapple with texts and traditions from their own religions with the insights of friends and colleagues who may be looking at these texts with fresh eyes, that is to say, as outsiders. It also creates space for participants to listen to how their friends understand and interpret their religious traditions. At the same time that I assert the necessity of positive interreligious contact that deeply engages religious traditions, I acknowledge that both historically and in our own time, encounters between religious communities have also been fraught and sometimes even violent. Indeed, this violent encounter has often erupted as a result of the direct clash of competing religious claims. This brutal heritage of interreligious encounter can sometimes inspire those who wish to promote peace and harmony between divergent religious groups to, in essence, leave religion out of it. Meaning that the only kind of peaceful interreligious encounter must bracket from the discussion the central texts, beliefs, and rituals that lie at the core of a person's religiously informed worldview. So the sort of adage of it's not polite to discuss politics and religion at the dinner table. Yet this sort of avoidance, I think, is limiting in two important ways. If we want to better understand how persons with religious beliefs different than ourselves construct their worldviews and their ethics, or put another way, how these religious others make meaning in their lives, we should try to know more about the religious framework that shapes their life. We have an opportunity also to learn about ourselves and better understand and articulate our beliefs, our commitments, our worldviews by only talking religion with people like ourselves. In other words, I am a better Roman Catholic because of my engagement with Jewish beliefs, Jewish texts, and Jewish interpretations. I return to my own texts, beliefs, and traditions with new eyes. Thus, in both my intellectual life and in my practical work at the Institute for Christian and Jewish Studies, I create opportunities for both Christians and Jews, clergy as well as laity, to learn together about the various traditions we respectively espouse. Now, the Jewish-Christian dialogue in particular. So that's what I do for a living, so that's what I'm going to sort of focus on, and that's what the talk is for the rest of the evening. So there are particular aspects to Jewish-Christian encounters that make them somewhat unique in the world of interreligious dialogue. Namely, Judaism and Christianity are intimately related to one another. The histories of the two communities are bound up together, and of course, central to this intimacy is the fact that the communities share sacred texts. This is, of course, not a claim that the Jewish Tanakh and the Christian Old Testament are exactly the same. There is enough difference in both content and the order of the biblical books to argue otherwise. Yet at the same time that there is a real difference between the Jewish Tanakh and the Christian Old Testament, there's undeniably much correspondence. Some texts are shared, even while the interpretation of them is not. So a friend and colleague in interreligious dialogue at Georgetown, Father Dan Madigan, has a helpful analogy I'd like to share. So a book of the Bible, like Isaiah, for example, is likened to a couch from IKEA, or any other patent piece of mass-produced furniture. You might own that couch yourself, and you use it in your family room. You've enjoyed it for years. It's comfortable for your whole family. It resists stains. It's a great piece of furniture. You go to a new friend's house, and you walk in, and you see that she owns the exact same couch, except she's using it in a formal living room. You walk in and you say, hey, I have the same couch, but seeing it in a more formal setting, it looks a little bit different. You've always thought of this couch as a workhorse, as something that you can get stains out of really easily. But here it is, next to a fireplace, with a cashmere throw, some better-looking pillows, and it looks like a whole new couch, like you've had an HGTV makeover. Surely you'll hope to commiserate with your friend about the ability of the couch to resist stains, to be the workhorse piece of furniture, and you hope to sort of share some aspects of what you think the couch does. But then at the same point, you might go home at the end of the evening and decide you need to buy some better pillows. So, all joking aside, this level of intimacy, namely not simply sharing similar stories, but truly sharing scriptures, having the same couch, has been the source of both benefit and harm in the history of the Jewish-Christian relationship. Indeed, much can be said, and has been said, on how competing or contrasting interpretations of a shared sacred text has resulted in confusion, antagonism, and even violence between Jews and Christians. While this is certainly true, seeing different interpretations of shared sacred texts as a clash need not be normative, need not be the way that we go. Examining and embracing different interpretations as a benefit, as a blessing, if you want to use a religious category, is the mode that I believe needs to be promoted and can be promoted in our present times. So in other words, in looking at the history of Jewish-Christian relations through the lens of scriptural interpretation, we need to both own the real difficulties of the past while imagining the possibilities of the future, where differing interpretations need not be competing, but rather different interpretations can be put into fruitful conversation. And so that is exactly what we're going to be doing for the rest of the evening. Namely, exploring a sacred text shared by Jews and Christians, Isaiah's suffering servant. We will look at different interpretations of the text from various points in history and attempt to put them in conversation with one another. We'll end the evening by looking at a visual interpretation of the passage made by a contemporary American Christian illuminated Bible, namely the St. John's Bible, which will be hosted by Augustana in the upcoming year. I hope to gather by my use of pronouns that I hope that we can do this work together. The text under considerations will be on the screen, but they're also available in handouts that are, thank you, Dr. Murphy, coming around right now, for you to take notes on and take home. The rest of the evening will be interactive in format. I will no longer be yelling at you from the front of the room, but reading with you the following text and posing to you some interpretive questions that I hope we can answer together. This text is very familiar to Christians, but less so to contemporary Jews. A possible reason for this difference of familiarity has to do with how this text lives in each community. This text is largely familiar to Christians and unfamiliar to Jews, in part because the text is prominently featured in the Christian lectionary and is noticeably absent from the Jewish lectionary. So just a point of clarification, the term lectionary refers to specific scripture readings that are appointed to particular days in the liturgical year, or in the sort of holiday cycle, and the regular cycle as well. The Jewish community has Torah and Haftarah, which are readings from the prophets, portions that are read regularly and on certain holy days. Likewise, Christians have certain scriptures that are read weekly in a certain order and during major holy days. So while many Jewish communities regularly read huge portions of the book of the prophet Isaiah during their regular liturgical cycle, this part of Isaiah, this passage, is generally omitted. In contrast, looking at the Roman Catholic Revised Lectionary, this passage from Isaiah is read on Good Friday every year, which is a place of great importance in the Christian liturgical calendar. Knowing that the Good Friday service commemorates the crucifixion of Jesus, it is apparent that in the Christian imagination, pairing this Isaiah text with the Good Friday celebration is understood to illuminate the most challenging part of Jesus' story, his suffering and his death. Now, lectionaries are not permanent things. Indeed, they develop and change over time. Some scholars have suggested that the radical omission of this Isaiah text from Jewish lectionaries over the last 1,500 years, and indeed a certain absence of rabbinical input on this particular biblical passage, is a result of the prominence of the Christian interpretation of this text as a meditation on Christ's suffering and crucifixion. In other words, the Christian interpretation is so dominant, it has crowded out any Jewish interpretation of the text, and even arguably pushed the text out of the Jewish reading cycle. The issue of Jewish avoidance of this text is something that we will revisit briefly later, but something I wanted to sort of bring to your attention now. So we're going to begin by reading the NSRV translation of this passage, but I'm not going to do sort of a direct exegesis of the biblical text. I am not a scholar of the Bible. I will leave that to Dr. Murphy. Rather, I want to talk with you about how this biblical text has been interpreted and understood in later Jewish and Christian communities. So right after we're going to look at the Isaiah text itself, we'll linger only for a few moments with our own thoughts on the sacred scripture before moving on to the texts that help us understand how later Christian and Jewish communities have understood it. All right. Do I have a volunteer? Anyone like to read from Isaiah?
Isaiah, book 52, verse 13. See, my servant shall prosper, he shall be exalted and lifted up, and shall be very high. Just as there were many who were astonished at him, so marred was his appearance beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of mortals. 15. So he shall startle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him, for that which had not been told them they shall see, and that which they had not heard they shall contemplate. 53 verse 1. He who has believed what we have heard, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? 2, for he grew up before him like a young plant and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. 3, he was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity, and as one from whom others hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him for of no account. 4, surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases, yet we counted him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. 5, but he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. 6, all we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. 7, he was and like a sheep that before its shears is silent, so he did not open his mouth. 8, by a perversion of justice he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? For he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. 9, they made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. 10, yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. When you make his life an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring, and shall prolong his days. Through him the will of the Lord shall prosper. 11, out of his anguish he shall see light. He shall find satisfaction through his knowledge. The righteous one, my servant, shall make my righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. 12, therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he exposed himself to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors.
Thank you very much. There are 2 questions that I want us to consider over and over and over again. First, who is the servant in this passage? The second one is, how is the suffering to be understood? What do we know about the servant just from this passage? Is the servant suffering because he's done something wrong? No. So the servant is an innocent. What happens to the servant?
Basically gets tortured and beaten up, I guess.
Physically, not very pleasant. Not very pleasant for the servant. So how do you think the suffering is to be understood, just looking at the passage?
Like he didn't deserve the suffering, I guess.
He didn't deserve it. We know he's an innocent.
Right.
So then what's going on? Is he fighting back?
No.
No. Yeah.
He's doing it for others, for other people's sins. He was at that end at least.
So he's doing this for others. He's bearing the sort of the suffering for others. The first interpretive text we're going to look at is the first 2 we're going to look at is Jewish interpretations of the passage. We're going to read both the rabbinic Midrash and Numbers and a selection from Rashi, who's a famous and influential medieval Jewish commentator. So the Midrash on Numbers 13:2, the rabbinic Midrash is completed roughly in the 12th century, though it contains earlier materials. So, for this reason, the Holy One, blessed be he, will in the hereafter regale Israel in the Garden of Eden, and prepare incense for them of all kinds of spices. I've eaten my honeycomb with my honey, implies that because Israel exposed their souls to death and exile, as you read, because he exposed himself to death, Isaiah 53:12, and busied themselves with the Torah, which is sweeter than honey, the Holy One, blessed be he, will therefore in the hereafter give them to drink of the wine that is preserved in its grapes since the 6 days of creation, and will let them bathe in rivers of milk. I'm going to read both of the Jewish interpretations first. This is Rashi. Despised and rejected by others, Isaiah 53:3, was he. So is the custom of this prophet. He mentions all Israel as one man. For example, fear not, my servant Jacob, and now hearken, Jacob, my servant. Here too, see my servant shall prosper, he said, concerning the house of Jacob. So for the Jewish commentators, who is the servant? Jacob the individual, or or
Kingdom or something, the house?
the house of Jacob. So earlier in the passage, earlier in the Rashi, Rashi says, so is the custom of this prophet. He mentions all Israel as one man. All of Israel, all of the house of Jacob, basically the Jewish people as a whole. The commentators are pointing out are used in this passage. Looking back at the Midrash on Numbers, you'll notice in the sort of middle part after the Song of Songs citation, implies that because Israel, meaning the Jewish people, the people of Israel, exposed their souls to death and exile, and busied themselves with the Torah, the Holy One, blessed be He, will therefore in the hereafter give them to drink of the wine. So who is the servant in Jewish interpretation? The Jewish people. So how is suffering to be understood then? The suffering of the Jewish people. Just guessing. First impressions.
The nation as a whole.
So the nation as a whole is who's doing the suffering.
Right.
So how is the suffering to be understood? Is it supposed to be, are they innocents? Yes. Right? So the implication of the passage is that the Jewish people are innocent, yet they're still suffering. So then what's the point of their suffering, according to these interpretations? If you're an innocent and you're suffering, what's the point? So where do you see that? So the redemption language is interesting.
I guess like in the Rashi, see my servant shall prosper.
Yeah, see my servant shall prosper at the end of Rashi. Also at the end of the Midrash, it says, in the hereafter, give them to drink in the wine, right? So in the afterlife, there'll be some benefit to this. Or if not be a benefit, there'll be some sort of recompense for the fact that the suffering happened.
Well, they also busied themselves with the Torah,
Yes.
which was sweeter than honey. So
Yes.
even though they're suffering,
They're still
they're
following.
faithful.
Right. No, that's a lovely point as well. One then questions whether if
One
they
needs
didn't,
that.
yeah. So what would happen? All right. So those are sort of two Jewish texts I want to sort of bring up at this point. So who is the servant? Israel, the Jewish people. How is suffering to be understood? It's understood as sort of an exile in the Midrash. That's actually something we didn't point out. Their souls to death and exile. That they were forced out of their land. And that they're also physically suffering. But it's also clear that they're innocent, that this is not suffering that was done for a cause. So now we're going to switch to New Testament texts, and we clicked over the Gospel of Mark. I have another volunteer. You who nominated your friend.
Sure. Alright, so Mark 10. Jesus said to his disciples, whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you will be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many.
Okay. So who is the servant according to the Gospel of Mark? Yes.
Jesus?
Well, so, yes, we'll get there. What does the text say first? Son of Man, right? So verse 45. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. But you're right. That the Gospel of Mark is referring to Jesus. So how is the suffering then of Jesus to be understood? He gave his life as a ransom for many. To go back to you, this is a redemptive suffering. So what's the takeaway lesson for the disciples, right? So this is who Jesus is saying this to his disciples. What are the disciples supposed to do? Very first line. Whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. So what's the charge to the disciples? To imitate Jesus in this matter. To imitate the suffering, to imitate the level of servitude. All right, moving on to 1 Peter. You volunteered your friend to do a very long passage, so we're going back to you for 1 Peter.
Okay, so 1 Peter 2. Slaves, accept the authority of your masters with all deference, not only those who are kind and gentle, but also those who are harsh. For it is a credit to you if, being aware of God, you endure pain while suffering unjustly. If you endure when you are beaten for doing wrong, what credit is that? But if you endure when you do right and suffer for it, you have God's approval. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, no deceit was found in his mouth. When he was abused, he did not return abuse. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but when he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that, free of sins, he might live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were going astray like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls.
Okay, so for 1 Peter, who is the servant? Jesus. And who, so in this passage, the slaves that are mentioned right at the beginning, how is Jesus as a servant supposed to be in relationship to slaves, and how slaves are to be in the world, according to the text?
If you follow God, you're going to endure the pain while you are actually suffering.
So you're an innocent, and you're suffering, but you shouldn't do anything about it. So Christ's suffering is to be an example of how to be in the world, sort of an explanation of the suffering of innocence. What's the reward then for this suffering according to the passage? Looking at verse 20, I believe. God's approval. What do we think about this? Are we disturbed? I hope we're disturbed. Maybe a little bit, tiny bit. This theme of how to understand suffering and what to do in the face of the suffering of innocence is one that comes up over and over and over again, this idea of redemptive suffering. And it's troublesome. It's a hard thing to deal with, and it's a hard thing in Christian tradition to deal with.
Unless you're the master, right? And you wrote this text, in which case it comes off as pretty useful, yes? Because you can say to your slaves, you have to suffer because Jesus suffered. And if you want to be a good slave, then you suffer like Jesus.
And in the previous passage, going back to the Gospel of Mark, when you're saying to your disciples, whoever must be great among you is going to be your servant. Well, I'm Catholic, so I'm going to talk about my own community. So if I go up to my archbishop and say, you need to be a servant to all, and he maybe lives that out, maybe not, but he's still in a very much a position of authority. Very much in a position of authority. So this charge to the disciples to live out this example has a sort of different ring to it when you're talking to someone who's in a position of authority. You're talking in 1 Peter to slaves who are not in a position of authority and telling you your suffering must continue because this is what Jesus did. That has an entirely different ring to it. Yet it is seemingly citing the same passage, it's seemingly bringing the same concept to bear. So this text as it lives in sort of Christian tradition and Christian imagination is difficult. It's a really difficult text.
Isn't it difficult too? I'm disturbed by it, that because God approves of the suffering, which actually the text says. It was
Yes.
I underlined that, right? The Lord willed it. It was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. So that's disturbing. This is, if you suffer, then God approves.
Yes. And that's part of God's
Relationship
to people. And innocence. I think that's the sort of thing that pops up over and over and over again. To a certain extent, there's a sort of different category of suffering for someone who's done something that's wrong. But if you're an innocent in suffering for no reason, for nothing that you've done, that brings out a whole different valence. So another way this is lived in Jewish-Christian relations specifically. We're going to look at Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho. And I neglected to put on the handout the full title, and I caught that too late, unfortunately. But the full title is Dialogue with Trypho the Jew. So it's set up as a sort of disputation between a Christian and a Jew, written in the very, very early church, 100 to 165 CE. So if indeed Christ was not destined to suffer, said I to him, said the Christian to the Jew, and if the prophets did not foretell that because of the iniquities of the people he should be led to death, and be dishonored, and be scourged, and be reckoned among the ungodly, and be led as a sheep to the slaughter, whose birth, says the prophet, no one can describe, it were well to be astonished. But if the proper mark that distinguishes him and points him out to all, how can we ourselves fail to be confident now that we have believed in him? Indeed, all who have considered the words of the prophets will say that this person, Jesus, is the one referred to, and no other, as soon as ever they hear that he was crucified. So according to Justin Martyr, who's a church father, who is the servant? Once again, same question. Jesus the Christ. So how is the suffering to be understood? It's a sign, it's a marker, it's a demonstration that Jesus was the Messiah, that Jesus has fulfilled this prophecy. So therefore, Isaiah becomes the ultimate Christian proof text to a certain extent. When people talk about proof texting, they mean, I'm going to show you something, and I'm going to point to this text, and it's going to, a certain extent, end the argument. It's going to demonstrate so strongly my position. Here you go, I'm pointing to it. So sort of the ultimate Christian proof text. So why wouldn't this Jew, why wouldn't Trypho the Jew understand that if he understood the crucifixion and looked back to Isaiah, he should be a Christian? He should automatically convert. That the suffering of Jesus on the cross mirrors Isaiah and so therefore fulfills the prophecy. Indeed, there's this argument that's made that Isaiah is really the fifth gospel. That it's used so much in Christian liturgy, in the Christian imagination, and in Christian citation, and it defines, to a certain extent, the Christian world so heavily that it really should be considered the fifth gospel. It's a really kind of interesting argument. So, we've looked at some Jewish and some Christian interpretations of this text, utilizing two questions. Who is the servant? How is suffering to be understood? So who is the servant for the Jewish community? Just a recap. In the Jewish tradition, the Jewish people. And in Christianity, Jesus. Huge points of departure. So can you make any sense of that? Are these two things just, so there's this concept, I have a 2-year-old daughter, and up until a certain point, kids don't play with one another when they're really small. They'll play next to one another. So y'all be, building blocks over here, and a little friend will be over there playing with a stuffed animal. And they're very content with this, and it's called parallel play. And this is sort of a normal phase of development in small children. Well, there's a certain argument to be made that sometimes biblical interpretation in Jews and Christians, there can just be parallel play. I'm over here doing my thing, I'm going to argue that this is the Jewish people. You're over there doing your thing, and you think it's Jesus Christ. And we're just not going to talk about it. We're going to sort of separate those two things out. Or, I'm going to argue, we could put them in conversation. So, myself as a Christian, if I look at this text again and say, well, what does this say about the Jewish people? What does this say about the suffering of the Jewish people? If I read that text differently, what do I walk away with? Do I walk away perhaps more enriched? Do I perhaps understand Jesus in the Christian imagination a little bit better afterwards? Likewise, you turn to sort of a Jewish colleague and say, well, you, right, as we mentioned, have had to deal with this to a certain extent, the sort of dominance of this Christian interpretation for so long. Does this text mean anything to you? Can you read the Jewish people back into it? This text, particularly because of the suffering aspect, is really difficult for the Jewish community after the Holocaust, after the Shoah. Does the suffering of the Jewish people in the Shoah, does it mirror this? Should it be put into this text? Should it be interpreted in this way, shape, or form? Or is that somehow blasphemous? Is that somehow just not acceptable in any way, shape, or form? And so on sort of that note, I want to, again, just spend a few moments on the second question. So how is the suffering to be understood, right? Is it a path to save the community? This is a sort of traditional Christian interpretation, that Jesus' suffering was redemptive for the community. And so therefore explain how the community is saved. Is it to be understood as a model? Should the innocents suffer or be be put in a position of servitude in a certain way in order to model Jesus? So like I mentioned before, we were talking about disciples, we were talking about bishops, we were talking about people in authority, and you're saying you should also be a servant. I'm going to be on board. I'm going to say that's a pretty good message. It's something that our ministers should probably think about every once in a while. When you're walking to someone who's truly suffering and is in a position of slavery, both traditionally and in various forms today, and you say you should continue to suffer and model Jesus, I'm going to say no, it's not acceptable. I'm very troubled by that. And I'm troubled by that sort of interpretation. So what do you do when you have sort of competing interpretations? How do you sort of adjudicate that? Any sort of first thoughts or first impressions? Yes?
I feel like you have to look at the history of the rest of the text, not just this. Because if you look at, the Jewish, Torah and all that, they've been taught that you suffer because you've done something bad, and then all of a sudden here you're innocent and you're suffering. I guess to wrap your mind around that you shouldn't endure that is something that maybe they just don't, they can't see, and this is why this hasn't been that prominent in Jewish traditions.
It's an interesting but not historically accurate read, I would say, as to why it's been omitted. Because there are two strains in the sort of Torah that have to do with the Jewish people are suffering because of some sort of mistake or something that's been done wrong. But then there's also suffering that's unexplainable or unaccountable. But it's an interesting point.
We just talked about Proverbs, so it
Oh.
makes sense that would be.
Gotcha. Okay, so I want to end by talking about the St. John's Bible, which is coming next year to Augustana. There's going to be lots of different opportunities, and they kindly sent the text with us today. I don't know if we should gather everyone around, or lean it forward, or we can also look at it on the slide. I don't know what the best thing is.
We can lean it forward.
I can lean it forward.
Yeah.
So the St. John's Bible was prepared in Minnesota from 1998 to 2011. It's the first handwritten, hand-illuminated Bible commissioned since the printing press. It's pretty incredible all the way around. It's also made in America right now, right? And so this is the sort of final thing that I want to talk about, is that we're all interpreters of our texts and of our traditions, and we're constantly affected by our own histories, the histories of the countries and the cultures that we live in right now. So when we sit down and we read Isaiah again, as an American in 2013, what do we do? What's the sort of history that is going to be inflected in this? So as it's going around, you can see it in a small version on the screen. And then also, you guys are doing a lovely job of bringing it around. So what do you guys see? So the table that has the book right now is going to be put on the hot seat. What do you see? Who is the servant?
Who's the servant? Where do you notice in the picture?
What do you see? The figure in the middle? Okay. What does the figure look like? So you're looking at his front or his back. Can you tell if it's a man or a woman? You think it's a man? Okay. Why? Short hair? All right, I'll buy it. We're going with it. It's a man.
So maybe he's very skinny.
So he's very skinny. He's emaciated. What is he doing? Where's the second hand?
73 times something.
Yeah.
You're doing excellent.
Yeah, it's just heavy.
Yeah. So he's in this sort of position, I think like this, right? So you'll all see in a second, but the servant, you can sort of see him on the front of the screen here as well. This figure right here we're talking about, he's male, he's emaciated, he's got his back towards us, his hand on his head and his other arm sort of behind. We have mentioned nothing about his skin color. Skin tone. Dark. Really, really dark. Where is he standing? Do you know? So he's in front of something. What does he appear to be looking at? He's up at the stars, and then what's the figure? This sort of the cross, right? So it's a figure of a cross. What do we think these things around him are? What do they look like? Railroad tracks. They do look like railroad tracks. That's exactly right. So what's below him? Do you see the animal down there? There's a little animal at the bottom.
It's a ram.
It's a ram. It's a ram right there. Now, can you see the sort of faint work that's being done around the words? The table that has the book right now, what does that look like? What's the sort of background material? Is it a fence? It looks like a fence. So in the context of this image, is the fence keeping him in, keeping him out? What do you think? All right, so we've got a fence, we've got a person, a man, emaciated man, of very dark skin, we've got railroad tracks. What's being referenced here? Keeping in mind that this is a Bible made in America now.
Underground Railroad.
Underground Railroad. That's definitely one possible interpretation. So the sort of suffering and the liberation model. What else is being referenced? Underground Railroad. Why do we need an Underground Railroad? Slavery. Slavery in the United States. The legacy of slavery in the United States. So then is the Isaiah passage supposed to be put onto the sort of American historical experience of slavery? What does that mean? Is that a good thing? Do you want Isaiah to be used to explain American slavery? I would want to spend a little time thinking about that before I said yes or no. Whatever horrible thing in the 20th century happened with train tracks?
There's a lot of Asian Chinese people came over and worked on railroad tracks.
A lot of forced labor and the creation of the American railroad system. And in Europe, since we're trying to figure out, does this text allow, or this image allow for any sort of Jewish reading of this? There was a concentration camp imagery, right? The Jewish people being taken away on the trains. And I think the sort of faint line of the train tracks on either side evoke both the railroads of the U.S., the Underground Railroad, the railroads of the Holocaust. Now, the centrality of the sort of cross at the top, does that allow for any kind of space for a Jewish interpretation? Or is it pretty clear who the servant is supposed to be? Do you think any sort of Jewish person would be able to see themselves in this image? Outside of the train tracks, which I think is definitely true. It's pretty difficult. It's pretty difficult to read a Jewish interpretation into this image at all. But it is interesting to read the American history angle into this interpretation, which I think is very pleasant. So what are your first impressions of this image? Or like, I guess, second impressions at this point? Do you like it? Do you find it disturbing? Confusing?
It looks Chinese.
It looks Chinese?
Yeah.
What do you mean?
I don't know. Little thing.
It's interesting because I've seen this a lot, and I've always immediately thought, oh, that looks like the Holocaust. So it's interesting to think through that a Jewish person might not see themselves in it because of the cross. Because I look at that and think that looks like a concentration camp. That's exactly what I've thought every time I've looked at it. So that's interesting to me, noticing the whole thing's a cross, that not just the gold part, the whole shape of it is a cross.
That's a lovely, lovely point. And you see what she's talking about? That this goes all the way up, and then this is also the cross as well.
And is that, what animal is that at the bottom exactly?
I believe it's a ram.
Well, that's interesting to me because a ram is not referred in the text at all.
So where do you think the ram comes in?
Well, it's got to be the Abraham and Isaac story.
Yeah.
The ram caught in the thicket who served as a substitute for
Right.
Isaac's sacrifice.
And so from a Christian interpretive lens, who is also the ram?
Well, Jesus.
Yeah. That sort of conflates again a very Christian reading into this text. I mean, to be fair, the St. John's Bible is a Christian Bible. This is not the Tanakh. This is the Old Testament. So it is very much a time and a space for a Christian interpretation of the text. But I think it's sort of thinking about the longer history of this text and how it lives so very differently in the Jewish and the Christian traditions, such that the Christian interpretation of it has essentially crowded out a Jewish voice. To see this image again created now just sort of drives that home again, that there really is no space for a Jewish interpretation of the text. And I just want to sort of close by saying that I would argue that the Christian community has lost something by that. That by entirely crowding out a Jewish interpretation of this, the Christian community is lacking something, lacking some sort of insight and opportunity. And this is something that you guys and we can do to recover. We can correct this because we're all interpreters. We're all people who create meaning in our lives and in our communities. And so there's an opportunity always to sort of take a text and shift it slightly. So at that point, I think I'd like to close and see if there's any sort of questions, comments, concerns that you would like to share.
Well, I think there's another possibility, and that is that the text is what I would call an existential commentary. Okay, so it doesn't have to be, I don't know why we have to always set up this kind of competing religious traditions thing. So, you know, if we say, well, this really refers to the people of Israel, and we go, oh, great, yeah, that's right, the Jews won, and great, it's all about Israel, so it's got to be that. And they, you know, or, you know, it's got to refer to Jesus. then all the Christians say, great, yeah, it's really about Jesus, it's not about Israel. So that just proves how great the Christian tradition is. Couldn't it refer to really the human experience? I mean, how can we keep getting people like Jesus who, as you say, are innocent, but we put them to death? Or how come this happens to the people of Israel? So that, the Holocaust and so forth. And how come it happens to the people of Rwanda? You can go down the line. I don't see why do we always have to interpret the Bible so that one group is right, so that either I'm right or JD's right. And we both can't be right because one's got to be right or the other's wrong, So it's either got to refer to Israel or it's got to refer to Jesus. It could refer to both, and it could refer to all of us, the whole human experience.
Yeah, no, that I think is a nice summation of what I was trying to do, is that you can live with this sort of tension. You can bring it up and sort of have it live side by side, but that there's a lack when somebody's crowded out so that there's only one interpretation. So that the Christian community, even where it's placed, that we read this on Good Friday, and you can't not, when you're put it in that context of the Good Friday service, you have to read it one way. And that there's a sort of, there's a lack because there isn't any space in the Christian imagination for it being the people of Israel. But then you also sort of collapse that with the problem of, in a post-Shoah and a post-Holocaust environment, well, what do you do? What do you do with the suffering of the innocent Jewish people? Do you somehow see it as redemptive, or do you somehow see it as being rewarded in the afterlife? And then there's the larger question about who decides, right? So if I'm a Christian and I walk up to a Jewish friend and say, okay, this is how I think a Jewish interpretation of a text should be, there's a certain presumptuousness in that. I still would maybe suggest it, maybe I'd frame it slightly differently, but I can really, for as far as claiming it in your sort of religious tradition and your religious experience, I would sort of default towards saying, okay, I can offer a Christian reading or a Christian interpretation of this text, but I might not necessarily presume to explain the suffering of the Jewish people with Isaiah. That would make me uncomfortable. And so just sort of playing around with the idea of authority and ownership and interpretation, this is something that you always have to dance with when you're doing interreligious study and text exchange. So I sort of bring that up as another point. Did you have your hand up? No? Yes? No? Okay. Anyone else?
I think it's pretty interesting, and I'm a Christian person who's always wanted to be Jewish and fascinated by Judaism. So I keep thinking of, well, certainly, this is not a trick question, but certainly Jesus would have understood himself to be a part of the community of Israel, which already would have had a communal understanding of being people who suffer post-exile. So it's interesting, that was already a part of their communal identity, and he would have spoken from that identity as a community ethos. We have suffered for a long time. And so that's interesting for me to just think about that he would not have been pulling out of nowhere the idea.
So you have nicely described the recent argument by Daniel Boyarin.
Oh.
Yes,
I have.
Yes, you have. Very succinctly, because he makes the argument that Jesus was a Jew, Jesus was operating in a Jewish framework, Jesus read Isaiah, the early Christian community who were all Jewish, also were familiar with Isaiah, and used this text because it was a Jewish text that was central to Jewish identity and central to Jewish life. Which is why the lack of the text later on, Boyarin is suggesting, is because a Christian reading crowded it out, but that it originally was a Jewish idea. It came from a Jewish Jesus and a Jewish Christian community at the beginning. And so he just put that out formally. You probably were collaborating with him.
Right. Well, because we cannot get to Christianity without a Jewish Jesus.
Right.
We can't get there.
Yeah.
So.
Well, thank you all for coming and for listening and learning, and this has been wonderful for me, hopefully enjoyable for you as well. And thank you for my readers who were volunteering. Not really. You were voluntold, both of you.
You did excellent, Roman. That was as well.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.